Okay? The fight or flight response is when you look at it, oh geez, and that saves your life. That's helpful. If we were in this room, suddenly there was an earthquake, people say, oh my goodness, let's get out, let's do something. That's normal, that's good, that's helpful. But what happens with stress disorders or post-traumatic stress, which we'll talk about, is that it kind of over-occurs and it's not just the normal functioning anymore. So what can happen with this normal kind of thing is that eventually we can experience high levels of anxiety and it may not be appropriate situations. And that's where it can develop to stress disorders. What distinguishes fear from anxiety, basically fear is an immediate alarm response. Someone walks in here and has a gun, we're going to feel fear. That's good. That's normal. You ought to feel fearful. Okay, that's something that's good to know. Anxiety is a state of alarm in response to a vague sense of threat or fear. So you watch that video and you say, oh my gosh, I'm busting my chops to go to school, and in a couple of years what I'm learning now is going to be changed. You know, when I was teaching, I'd often tell my students, okay, now that you graduated, now the real education begins. Because you've got to keep on going back and keep on, you know, getting refreshed. I mean, you know, it's not over, it's never over. It's over when they kind of put you down, whatever it is, 6, 8 feet or whatever. It's never over. There's always more if you want to stay on the cutting edge. Both of these, whether it's anxiety or fear, have the same physiological response. I threw this in, put a couple of diagrams. Where are our health science students? Health science. I put a couple of diagrams of the body in there, because I know you're familiar with that stuff. Where are the criminal justice students? They might not, you know, we'll give some other stuff for you. We've got some things in there. Everyone will feel comfortable here. But when we're talking about mental disorders in the United States, we're talking about anxiety disorders, about 18% of the adult population sometime in their life will have experienced it. Only though, 1 in 5, 1/5 of those individuals will seek treatment. That's like having a hand that doesn't function and not going for treatment. Because anxiety disorders, even though they're one of the highest disorders, I don't want to say the word easiest, they're probably the most available for treatment. But sometimes the sense of anxiety is so overwhelming, people won't seek treatment. Until last year, I had practiced for about 32 years as a psychotherapist. And I always have to watch when I say that word, because if I don't say it quickly, people will, he was a psycho therapist. So, and early in my career, most of my career, I worked with anxiety disorders. And it's very uncomfortable, but the success rate can be very, very high. Most people who have one type of anxiety disorder will have another. Here's a whole bunch of them. There's 6 disorders in it. The one we're going to look at is the post-traumatic stress disorder. A whole bunch of others that, if we have more time, we can talk about. Let's talk a little bit about stress, because everybody uses the term stress. Everybody, you know, it's end of the semester and people are under stress. You had to get up this morning. It's stress. I mean, it's just that normal response. That's stress. People talk about it, again, like it's not normal. It is normal. The stressor is the event that creates the demand. A test, a survey. You've got state boards, national boards, boards in your car, all kinds of boards. We've got all kinds of things you got to deal with. There's always something that's there. And the stress response is the person's reaction to the demand. Important piece here is, it is influenced by how we judge both the event and our capacity to react to that event. So when people say, I'm stressed about my test, I would say, well, did you know we were going to have it? Well, yeah. Okay. It's there. It's like me being stressed about speaking into a microphone. It's, you know, some people say, I don't like a microphone. I didn't know I had feelings, but you know, it's like, the microphone's not for me, it's for you. So how we look at this, it's normal to have tests. It's normal to have things not work out. It's normal, blah, blah, blah. Disasters are not normal. Even though there may be a lot of tornadoes going on, that's not something that is within the sense of norm. So again, people who sense they have the ability and the resource to cope are more likely to take stressors in stride. So part of this is a mindset of resilience. a mindset of saying, what happens, not, whatever happens, I'll deal with it kind of thing. Like this, right after I get done with this, I'm taking off, some people know, I'm taking off to do a Tough Mudder down in Austin, Texas. My sons are meeting me down there, their girlfriends, my wife and I, we're gonna do a Tough Mudder tomorrow. So we got these, we got these shirts saying, Battisti tough. And I'm thinking, oh, mine's gonna be Battisti's gonna slow down. People go, what's your time? Time. I hope it's not my time. I hope I can get, it's to begin and get done and have a lot of mud on me. But again, if I was like, oh my gosh, you can't do this, it ain't gonna happen. How many runners we have? Do we have any runners? Good. We have any walkers? Do we have any sitters? Okay. If you start a run, you know as well as I, Tom Carter, nationally ranked runner for years, who works here at the college. And he said there's some days you got it and some days you don't. But if you get up to thinking, oh my God, I can't run, it's going to happen. You're not going to be able to do it. I'm not saying, think you can do it and click your heels 3 times and it'll happen. But that's really a part of it. Same thing here with anxiety, really important. So, fight or flight, as I mentioned, sympathetic nervous system. Here, I'm going to skip over that. There's for health sciences, I'm doing something for you. You all know what those things are. Let's put it by this time, you better. Okay, that's a body in the middle, if you weren't sure. All kinds of stuff. So you got the sympathetic nervous system gets us ready for the danger. You're really ready for danger. It gets ready. And the sympathetic nervous system is that thing afterwards. Whenever you have a stressor, you're like, and you get through it. Like today with the mock disaster, real thing, You'd be in it, you get it done. You ever have something happen and you are like on course, you know what to happen. And then like 3 days later, you get a cold, you break down, all that kind of stuff. That's exactly what the sympathetic nervous system. You have the sympathetic nervous system and then the parasympathetic nervous system. The other thing, and this is going to be important to keep in mind, the second pathway is when you have the hypothalamic and the pituitary adrenaline pathway. What happens is when we're faced with that, our brain starts reacting. Everything happens in the brain. Sometimes people think, they don't take care of the brain. Wear helmets or we eat foods that aren't good for the brain and stuff like that. I think we think our brain sometimes is in Hoboken, New Jersey or something. That's right. It's right here, not that far away. And this regulates everything. And so what happens is you have all this stimulation that goes on, hormones. When you've had that stressor, you can just feel it all over and later you kind of let it go. That's something that's happening. It's normal. But if it happens too much, that can deteriorate your health. And that's why heart and diabetes and all of that is tied into stress. Not necessarily the number of stressors you have, but your reaction to stress. So people say, oh, I got a lot of stress. Okay, but what's the reaction to it? There was a woman, I just saw on TV, in one of these shootings, something, and she lost her child. And it always drives me crazy when they interview the parents of someone who just lost someone. Is that news? I don't know what that's all about. But anyway, she said, she said it's a horrific, and she went through all that. She said, but this has given me something. I need to do something about this. I can't just let it happen. I have to do something about it. She was already coping with it, and I would say it would not deteriorate her body or her mind or her future as much as couldn't let it go. And some people can't let it go. It's not, like, I love when people say, well, all you got to do is, especially being a therapist, I'll tell people I'm a therapist, they go, I don't know why people have to come to you. All you got to do is let her go. What the heck is that all? We have this thing about being tough, well, we have it in our thing, but we know we're not always tough. Coping is a process that we go through. Oh, here's another one for you. There's burning, all that stuff. Makes it all two things you want to keep in mind. There's trait anxiety. This is what we're born with. Some people are just, they're there, no matter what happens. You see them in the day, they wake up in the morning, they're like, hey, how you doing? Have you had the coffee yet? There's just, other people, like I said, I love folks, they walk around, I'm not a morning person. Really, I thought you were The Walking Dead. That's and these differences do appear right after birth. And then there's state anxiety, and that's how we deal with situations. We'll talk about where we learn it. We learn it from watching our families, what happens with the people around us. Hear how someone handles their state anxiety. Here are the people that they hang with. Because, you know, if you have some people say, you know, that was really terrible, I'm terrible, I'm sorry that happened, but, you know, let's see what we can do, we're there for you. It's a lot different than, oh, wow. Wow, if you think you have it bad, you should hear what I had happen to me. I always like that when you go to someone with a cope and they tell you about their problems, then you walk away, you're like, So, what we're talking about today, there is acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress. Let me skip ahead here. Acute stress disorder, that's when the symptoms begin almost within 4 weeks of the event. And sometimes they only last about a month. It's still painful, it's still a disorder. But you know, within that month, things come together based, and we'll talk about some other stuff, based on our ability, biologically, our cultural sensitivity and stuff. And sometimes, and more often than not, it doesn't leave us. What starts to happen is people start to really begin and relive that event for months. And this can happen, especially with a lot of, well, I should say, all trauma. People may not have an original reaction, but then they may have it a year later, or 5 years later, or 20 years later. I remember years ago, they had second Woodstock. I was not able, even though I was of age, I was not able to go to the first Woodstock because we had a restaurant. My father said, "You got to work." My father came from Italy. "You're going to go dance or listen to music? I'll put the radio on. You work over here." So I was going to college and he was paying, so we had this. But the second Woodstock, my wife and I, we worked at it, and it was really great. But one night they had Green Fields, whoever. I met all these. I had no idea who half these people were. Hot Chili Peppers, all this kind of stuff. These, well, I really wanted to meet was Joe Cocker. I met him, and I remember him. But anyway, we're in our tent, and it was like 3 in the morning, and the helicopters kept on coming in, bringing in the acts and stuff. And so I woke up, and the Green Days, or whoever was playing, was having fireworks. And I woke up, and I could see all this, and I heard this coming in, and I said, oh my gosh, because I had Vietnam vets as clients, and they would relive this, and I thought, oh my goodness, if one of them was in this tent, they would have literally flipped out. And we tend to think it's going to happen right away. It doesn't always. It can happen 5 years, 10 years later. You know, because our mind is an amazing thing. And so these symptoms can continue, excuse me, for longer than a month. And about 80% of all acute cases will eventually develop into post-traumatic stress. And basically what these excuse me, symptoms are re-experiencing the traumatic event. Now, it doesn't mean they see it right there, but some people do. Some people, I remember, were very vivid. And others, it just gave them the same reaction. And it doesn't have to be combat. It can be a lot of other things. Avoiding things, avoiding them all, avoiding certain things, just avoiding people, whatever it may be. You know, people withdrawing from themselves. Reduced responsiveness. A lot of times, trauma victims won't have a response to something till a little bit later. A lot of times in treatment, it would be like they're a little delayed as they're talking, because a lot of this is physiological and psychological. And the other piece is the increased arousal, anxiety, and guilt. And a lot of times people will say, well, you have nothing to be guilty about, you didn't do anything. It's not a cause and effect. You don't have to have something happen to feel guilty when you're experiencing this as a disorder. It just happens because of all kinds of layered kind of events. So here's an example.
From as young as I can remember, my uncle would always try to get me, you know, somewhere alone and, you know, touch me and kiss me and just grope me inappropriately. And he would be so bold as we were having a formal dinner, to reach under the table and try to get in my clothes. It wasn't until really 30 years later that I had this point in my life where I just was sitting on the couch, and I all of a sudden didn't want to be in my marriage anymore, and my husband's the best. There's no reason for that. I had a great job. I was vice president at a company that, you know, I'd worked so hard to get where I'd gotten. We had a 6-bedroom, beautiful home. I had everything I could ever want, and I was at that point miserable. Some days, you know, my husband might just give me a kiss goodnight, and suddenly my heart starts to pound. You know, my head starts to throb, and I feel very afraid. And a lot of people think that flashbacks are just memories that you might remember, recall, maybe see a picture. But really what it is a re-experiencing of what happened. And so what will flash before my eyes is my uncle's presence there, a big presence on top of me. And it's completely unrealistic, but the feelings that I have are exactly like I'm this small child, that he's there, that I have no control, that I can't protect myself. And I was saying to myself, I know I feel this way, but I don't understand why. And that's the first time that I sought help. I went and saw a therapist, and we had a couple of sessions, and a few sessions in, she said, let's talk about your childhood. And I explained what a wonderful family I had, great parents, and we kind of eventually dove into, well, is there anything that really bothers you about your childhood? And I kind of just sort of nonchalantly said, well, my uncle used to do things to me when I was a child that, And she said, well, we'll need to work on that. Just because you have PTSD does not mean that you're crazy. And in fact, somebody who's been diagnosed with something has stepped up and said, I have these issues, I want help for these issues, and it's actually very treatable. I still have many episodes where I'll have, a flashback or a panic attack, but it's so controllable, and I know it's going to pass. So, and I know that it's the therapy and the medication and the cognitive behavioral work that I've done that's helped me get past that. It's a whole new way of thinking. What I wanted to show people was you can be a normal, thriving person and have mental health issues, get help for those and acknowledge those and still be okay. I was unable to envision that I would ever arrive at a point where I wasn't constantly thinking about what happened, or constantly having flashbacks, or constantly trying to shoo away those bad feelings. I can sit here today and say that, I have weeks go by where I don't think about it.
So there's an actual individual who suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. She's been in treatment. So you can see how well she can talk about it and have that reflection. And I think her message was really important. It's not a bad thing. In fact, as a therapist, a lot of times people would say something, and I'd say, I'm not worried about the people that are in treatment. I'm worried about the people that are not in treatment. Because people who are in treatment basically said something's up. I'm not functioning the way I need to. I want to function all that I can. So what triggers this? Hers was 30 years later. Like she said, her husband gave her a kiss, great marriage and everything. And suddenly she had this sense, this feeling. Well, it can occur anytime, but at least about 3.5% of the population are affected each year. 7 to 9% of people in the United States, sometime in their life. And what's helpful about post-traumatic stress, I think because of finally, the acknowledgement. I remember people coming back from the Vietnam War, probably a few of us sitting here remember it. And it was not talked about. It was not, even now in the military, they're having trouble, discussing. It's much, I don't want to say much, it's, at least they're discussing. They've been discussing for years. More people killed themselves coming back than died in the war. So when we make these decisions, we need to think about all this stuff. But anyway, about 2/3 do seek treatment. Usually the ratio is about 2 to 1 women after some serious trauma. And after a serious trauma, about 20% of women will develop the post-traumatic stress, about 8% of men. And again, a lot of these things, like we said, it's combat, it's disasters, abuse, victimization. It doesn't always have to be physical. It can be psychological in nature, can develop it. So let's talk a little bit about combat and stress disorders. Again, this is not new. I remember a good friend of mine who used to teach here, Angelo Zuccolo, his uncle suffered from shell shock. He was in World War II, and he was an artist. He was a sculptor before he went to the war. He was like 19 years old. Went to the war and came back and spent the rest of his life in bed, in veterans hospitals and stuff. Nothing physiologically, but he suffered from shock, from what do you call it, shell shock or combat fatigue, but they didn't know what it was. They didn't have the, the treatments that we have today. In fact, again, post-Vietnam War clinicians discovered that soldiers who experienced psychological distress after the combat, 30% of Vietnam veterans suffered from it. Another additional experience, some later, and that's very similar for people from Iraq and Afghanistan. And again, we're not talking about bad people. We're not talking about weak people. We're talking about individuals who have a disorder, some people would have a sore foot, some people would have a sore hand, some people have post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not the same kind of thing. And if you're in this field, all of the fields that you're in, you need to appreciate that and understand it, because ignorance to that raises the problem. Can you imagine experiencing something but not being able to talk about it? Because if you talk about it, everybody's going to think you're weird, especially your comrades. It's important. The strong one is the one who talks. Again, anything, disasters and stresses. So today we're going to have a mock disaster. So these are things that are not within the norm. That's what breaks about trauma. Combat, especially the kind of combat we have today, it's not within the norm. Do these things happen? Yes, but they're not supposed to happen. So someone would say the death of a loved one. Death of a loved one necessarily is not traumatic, it's sad, it's terrible, all of that. However, the death of a loved one. There's some folks in our family who the father was decapitated in front of the children in a car accident. That's trauma. The loss of a child for a parent may be traumatic, more than the regular kind of loss, because it's not in the norm. The norm is, as parents, we live and we pass on and the kids come along. So it's that kind of thing that's out of the norm. And again, because they occur more often, civilian traumas are 10 times more than combat traumas. But I don't think we always know that. Victimization. People who have been abused or victimized often experience lingering stress symptoms. Again, research suggests that more than 1/3 of victims of physical or sexual assault develop post-traumatic stress disorder, depending on, a lot of times, what happens immediately after for counseling and stuff, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Again, common forms of victimization or sexual assault, rape, is around 1 in 6 women are raped sometime in their life. Psychological input, it can last throughout their life. One study found that 94% of rape survivors developed an acute stress disorder within 12 days after the assault. Ongoing victimization, again, abuse in the family, can be psychological abuse, it can be family abuse. Again, this experience of terrorism or the threat of terrorism often leads to post-traumatic stress. I was speaking to a therapist who's from Saudi Arabia, and he works with people in those countries. He said it's like these whole countries are victimized by it because of the terrorism. It's constant. Torture, again, all kinds of things. Now, why do people develop? Why you can have two people experience the same thing. One experiences have post-traumatic stress disorder. The other one doesn't. Well, sometimes biological processes, the better health you are, sometimes may have an impact, depending on your sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. Our personalities, we'll look at childhood experiences that you've had, social support system, cultural backgrounds, and definitely the severity of the trauma. Some of the biological factors have to do with the way our brain functions. Again, there may be biological or genetic predispositions to such reactions. For anxiety disorders, it's always important to look at your parents, your biological parents. Because if they have an anxiety disorder, you have a much higher probability of developing one. But that means that what you can do is do preventative things. If you know you're going to be highly susceptible to, we'll say, anxiety disorders, then you do things in your life, lifestyle changes that will help you deal with those anxieties. Let me show you a little clip here.
I lost 2 of my best friends to the war. For a long time, I blamed myself for some of it because I felt that had I been there, that situation wouldn't have happened. And that's what drove me into depression, drove me into drinking, was that I felt so much guilt that I wasn't able to go back into country. I wasn't able to be with the guys that I fought with. Instead, I was home. Sometimes it's easier being the fallen than to be the only one left standing.
People with PTSD have been altered by their experience in ways that we can demonstrate through brain imaging. With our modern technology, we're able to actually see what's happening internally. And what we find is that people with PTSD react differently, especially to traumatic reminders, than do people without PTSD. Specifically, the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that has evolved for alerting the organism to threat, life-threatening situations for the individual who has PTSD, is much more active. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that basically reins in the amygdala, is often offline. And the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that basically sets the trauma in a context that can be remembered, is also hypoactive. So that what you have is essentially, in neurocircuitry terms, a perfect storm.
So our brain actually changes. And one of the reasons why sometimes people will have those experiences we talked about earlier is because your brain definitely changes in that process. The question is, can the brain change back? Well, as we learn to relax better and as we go through treatment, that can reverse itself. And so it's really important, that we seek out treatment. Now, here's some other factors. We talked about biological, look at your parents, that kind of thing. Also, physiological, if you've been in a traumatic experience, rape, combat, disaster, whatever, can cause somewhat permanent brain changes, not brain damage, but brain changes. Also, our personality factors. Remember we talked about it earlier, our trait anxiety and also our state anxiety. So again, here are some of the risk factors for people. If people have pre-existing high anxiety, they're anxious about everything, that may cause them to develop post-traumatic stress. Or people who have a negative worldview. For some of us, however we develop that kind of personality, things happen and we go, well, that's the way it is. I'll see what I can do. And other people, the other day I'm walking, I don't know, about 2 weeks ago when we had a sunny day, I was walking across campus and I said to someone, oh, what a beautiful day. Oh, it's supposed to rain for the next week. Okay, why let go? And I understand, and that is a personality factor after. Again, not good people, not bad. Some people think it's good or bad. I know there's going to be a lot, depending on if you believe in heaven and hell and all that kind of stuff, there are going to be a lot of positive people downstairs. Probably be a lot of negative people upstairs, okay? So it's not about being good or bad, it's how we develop our personalities. And on our personality, we're born with some of it, we can also develop it, which is something that I think is important. A set of positive attitudes called resilience and hardiness. You read these studies on people who have survived. They've been under houses for like 5 days and they survive. And one of the things you hear constantly is levels of resilience. Levels of resilience. It's like the student who has a tough time but knows they're going to get through it. They might not know they're going to get through it, but they're going to do everything they can to get through it. And some will say, I didn't do it, I'm dropping it. And again, it's not good or bad, but it's the sense of resiliency. One of the things we want to develop for our children is a sense of resiliency. So our childhood experiences are very, very important. Some of the risk factors doesn't mean that if you are poor, this will happen, but you have a higher probability of it. An impoverished childhood. Now that does not mean financial, necessarily. An impoverished childhood, well, let me ask you, what can be some examples of impoverished childhoods? Anyone?
Abuse.
Abuse. Yeah, abuse within your family. So it doesn't have to be poor or wealthy. It can happen in ever. What else?
Like loss of a family member or parent.
I'm
Not
sorry.
having a parent.
Yeah, it could be, someone missing, or having a parent and they're missing. Some people are there, but they're not there. What else? The television being the babysitter, right? Very impoverished. You know, well, they know that what's on at 1 o'clock, they know what's on at 2 o'clock, they know what's on at 3 o'clock, but they're not really sure, you know, what else is going on. That's an impoverished. You know, it's more and more, just we're starting an initiative, we're not starting the initiative. We've been asked by Assemblywoman Donna Lopardo to be part, to really spearhead reading in the community, because the number of children who are not one of the highest interventions for psychological health is reading to children. Reading to children. Oh, let me just throw this out. What's the #1 preventative intervention for most addictions? Food addiction, sexual addiction, alcohol, drug. Anyone know? #1 intervention, best intervention to help prevent it.
Never started.
I have dual hearing aids, so I don't have this location. Yeah.
Until I never started.
I'm sorry.
Never get the addiction going.
Never started. Okay. Okay. Anything else?
Some kind of distraction.
Some kind of distraction, like positive distraction.
Yeah, like redirecting the energy.
Yeah,
somewhere else.
redirecting. Anyone else?
Positive reinforcement.
I hear a voice. Yes.
Positive reinforcement.
Positive reinforcement. And all of those things can happen at the dinner table. Families eating together. #1, Penn State, time and time again. Families eating together. And when I mention that, because I do a lot of work in that field, my research is on childhood obesity. When I mention to people, they'll say, we don't have time. I say, okay. In a few years, you're going to wish you had that time. We have to make it. We have to make it. How many of you have dinner together? This is good. It's like a dinner together group. I love it. Important. It is important. Because what do you do at the dinner? Even if it's not the best situation, at the dinner table, you say, hey, you're looking good. I'm glad you're here. You know what happened? Would you do that hairdo? You know, whatever. Okay? You learn to share. There's one biscuit left and there's 42 of us. What do we do? Okay? You know? I mean, we learn to share. We hopefully talk about what happened. Or, I should say, the meal, if we do it, you know, if we're all sitting there going, or maybe I've heard people actually put their foods that they're eating on Facebook. I got someone in the office, did you see what Mary had the other day to eat? Who cares? I haven't even seen Mary. Oh, she's right here. I don't want to see Mary. Okay? Plus, I don't want to see that hamburger that she, you know, I mean, I don't know. It's just kind of, you got to laugh at the world. If not, you're going nuts. So. But it's important. Psychological disorders in the child, yeah. Experience of assault, all of this stuff in children whose divorce is below 10, or how the divorce is handled. If the divorce is handled as bad as the marriage was, rough time. It's about time parents realize you're the adults. Be adult in this. You don't have to love each other. Just be nice. Just be nice to each other. As the Dalai Lama once said to China, if you can't help us, don't hurt us. Social supports. People whose social and familial support systems are weak are more likely to develop stress disorders. Now, what do we mean by weak? It's quality of it. If everything you do, you're questioned, that's not family support. You're going to be questioned, but questioned in a progressive way. Or everything you do, you're okay. I remember I asked my students a lot of times, when I was teaching, they would talk about education and their kids, you know, and stuff. They say, oh boy, school does this, and school does that, and school does this. Then wait till I go in there. And people have asked me, I've been involved in this education for 43 years. And the people will say, what change have you seen? I said, well, when I was in school, I was always like in trouble, okay? Not big trouble, but my mouth. The nuns used to tell me, you know, Mr. Battisti was always Battisti after John the Baptist. Mr. Battisti, your mouth gets you in trouble. Jesus, it's right here, right? But anyway, and I say, you know, they say, what's the biggest difference? I said, well, you know, when I was a kid, if I got in trouble, I was in trouble. Now, if a kid gets in trouble, the teacher's in trouble. And some of you might be teachers someday. Keep that in mind. It is amazing to me. Not that everything the teacher says is right, but what's that old saying, where there's smoke, there's fire, you know? I mean, look at it, because we may be missing something, and that impoverishes the child's experience. And then multicultural factors. Some factors, in fact, I was just reading this stuff on like Hispanic Americans sometimes because of the need, not the need, but the desire for that connectedness, sometimes that may impact when there is stress disorders because people feel dislocated and non-connected. Severity of the trauma definitely is in it. Do we have till 10 or 10?
We were planning on 10 up. 10 up?
10 up.
Yeah.
One thing I can do is tell time. So, okay, treatment. Let's talk. 1 more minute on treatment. 9 up. Okay. Again, there's different kinds of treatment. The goals of treatment is to end the lingering stress reaction so the person's not so hyper or so delayed or so detached. I mean, especially in families. You know, if you have a loved one who she goes off to war, comes back and is detached, the person's very different. So we try to, you know, decrease that. Gain perspective on the big painful experience, just like that young woman we had, Gina. She stood it. She could understand. She said, every once in a while, I'll have an impact by it. But she understood it. And then returned to some level of constructive living. So there's drug therapy, there's behavioral exposure therapy, there's insight therapy. And you know, most people are in treatment with all of these. They may be, some people are so racked by their anxiety, you have to get them on a medication. One of the problems is, we call it flight into health. You get someone get on a medication to reduce their anxiety, they may not want to do the other treatment to change it because they feel so good. They say, why would I ever want to go back? That's the hard thing. That's where the relationship has to develop. But most all of this is used in connect injection together. So what I was going to do at the end was do a little relaxation.